Welcome to this first video in our module on interpersonal communication. In this module, you're going to first begin by looking at some myths or realities, and I'm going to ask you to really reflect on what you currently think about some different issues related to interpersonal communication. We'll then get started and begin looking at the basics of interpersonal communication. And there are 3 videos in this module, so be sure to watch each of these videos. And at the end of the last video, I'm going to be providing you with some test yourself questions. So be sure to take a look at those questions and at that last video. So let's get started. What do you think about this statement? Nonverbal communication occurs largely through people's facial expressions. Is this definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected mostly true, you're right. So while nonverbal communication does largely come through people's facial expressions, there are many other pieces of information that we get nonverbally. For example, we're going to be looking at distance that we have between ourselves and other people. And we're also going to be looking at the use of our hands and the rest of our body and how that tends to, or what that does in terms of communicating non-verbally. We'll also be looking at eye contact, and we're also going to be looking at touching. So we'll look at the role of gender and authority in whether or not we are inclined to touch another person, like touch their arm or their back when we're talking, and what that tells us about status differentials. Here's another one. What do you think? People show less emotion in work settings than in the home or when socializing with friends or colleagues. Do you think this is definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? What about you? Do you adjust your own behavior? Are you less inclined to show your emotions when you're at work than you are when you're with your friends or when you're just socializing with your colleagues outside of the workplace? If you selected definitely true, you're right. We definitely are controlled or more controlled of our emotions in our work environment. And the more familiar we are with people, of course, we are more inclined then to show our emotions. And then the setting also can play an important role in determining how much emotion we express. So if we think about being outside of a work setting, but yet with many of the same people, we're more inclined to show our emotions in that setting versus in that typical work environment. Let's look at another one. Liars, or people who are very dishonest. When people are lying, are they making less eye contact? Do they make less eye contact with others than do people who are telling the truth? So what do you think? Do you think liars make less eye contact? Or do you think that they don't, that they actually make more eye contact? So liars make less eye contact with others than do people who are telling the truth. Is this definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you selected definitely false, you're right. Now, what we're going to be looking at are the cues that we can get from others that tell us about deception. Keep in mind that there are always going to be people who fall outside of what is typical. And what you're going to be learning in this chapter is what the research has to say about what most often happens. So we'll be looking at many other components of detecting deception in this module as well. Let's look at this one. What do you think? Being assertive in a conversation is not the same thing as being aggressive. Sometimes we may feel like being assertive isn't the right thing to do because we fear that we're being aggressive. Some of you may have felt that way before, but actually being assertive and being aggressive, well, before I tell you the answer, what do you think? Are they the same thing or are they not? So what do you think about this statement? Is it definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? This is definitely true. They are not the same thing. Being assertive is very different from being aggressive. In this module, you're going to learn about assertiveness, and you're also going to be learning about how you can increase your own assertiveness. So let's go ahead and get started in our module. So what will you learn in this section? You're going to learn about the process of interpersonal communication and the components and features of the communication process. You're also going to be learning about technology and interpersonal communication. You'll be learning about social networking and communication and the relationship between communication and adjustment. So let's get started. Let's first take a moment to define what interpersonal communication is. When you look at the word interpersonal, there are two parts. There's inter and there is personal. Inter means between, among, mutually, or together. And the second part of the word personal refers to a specific individual or a particular role that that individual may occupy. So interpersonal communication is communication between individual people. We often engage in communication with one other person, but we also engage in communication with multiple people at a time. Like if you're trying to figure out with your roommates who should be doing chores, and or if you're in a workplace, you're trying to figure out among a work group who is responsible for what. So I think it's important to know, though, that the definition of interpersonal communication isn't just a quantitative one. So we're not just talking about numbers. What this means is that communication scholars view interpersonal communication qualitatively. And so qualitatively means that in terms of communication, it occurs when people communicate with each other as unique individuals. So interpersonal communication is this process of exchange where there's a desire and a motivation on the part of those who are involved to get to know each other as individuals, at least on some level. And so we're going to use this definition of interpersonal communication to explore a variety of different types of people we communicate with in our lives and the different communication processes. We're also going to be looking at conflict. We know that conflict is a natural part of interpersonal communication. And so we're going to be looking at many ways of understanding and managing conflict. We're also going to be looking at self-disclosure, and we'll be looking at the environment when we think about what are the ways that people vary in how they respond in different environments, and how does gender affect communication? How does culture affect communication? And what can we learn about nonverbal cues? These are just a few of the things that we'll be looking at that are related to interpersonal communication. Let's take a look at the components of the communication process. So first we have what is the sender, and this is the person who initiates the message. Now the sender is really a communicator because not only are they sending a message, but they're also watching for the cues that they receive from others. And these may be nonverbal cues that they're getting about, is the person that they're communicating to interested? So if we think about, giving a presentation, if you were in a public situation, you'd be looking at the audience members, and you'd want to see, are they leaning forward in their seats? Are they nodding their heads? They have positive or neutral facial expressions? Are they giving favorable vocal cues? Or are the audience members appearing bored? Are they disagreeing? Do they look like they're confused about the message? Are they texting? Are they looking away? Do they have unhappy or confused expressions? So the sender isn't just sending information, they're continuously receiving information and hopefully modifying the way that they're communicating so that the message that they're trying to convey is more effectively sent and received. So then we have the receiver, and this is the person to whom the message is targeted. And then we have the message, and the message is the information or the meaning that is transmitted from the sender to the receiver. And the message involves both verbal and nonverbal behaviors. And these verbal and nonverbal behaviors are interpreted with meaning by other people. So the verbal portion of the message would include things like the words that we say, while the nonverbal portion includes our tone of voice or maybe other non-vocal components like how we physically appear, our posture, our gestures, body movements, our eye behavior, and how we use space. I think it's also important to note that messages are not just simply messages. They can be unintentional messages or intentional messages. So when a message is intentional, that means that we have an image in our mind of what we want to communicate to an audience or to a person in a conversation. And we want to be able to communicate that with relative accuracy. And an unintentional message is sent when the message that we want to convey isn't the same as the message that the other person receives. So let's say that you've gone out to dinner with your significant other and they ask, did you have a good time? And let's say you did have a good time, but you're distracted by a TV commercial when you're asked. And so you reply in a neutral tone. You say, sure, I had fun. Your significant other might interpret your apathetic tone of voice and lack of eye contact to mean that you didn't really enjoy your evening with them, but in fact you actually did. So as in the process of communication, we might not always know that the message that we are intending to communicate is interpreted as we intend. In this instance, we'll probably fairly quickly find out that it was not interpreted as we intend, but we're not always receiving that communication. And so it's important that we are aware of not only what we say, but how we say it, our body language, our, how our facial expressions, our eye contact, so that we are really clearly communicating what we want to convey. We also have the channel, and this just simply means the way that the message or the means through which the message travels. In face-to-face communication, the channel involves all of our senses. So this can include things like what we see, what we hear, touch, and smell. And when we're communicating with someone online or when we're texting through our phones, the channel is obviously very different. And so, online it's our computer. When we're texting, it's through our phone. When we're watching TV, it's through the cable. And so the channel can have a very significant impact on the way that a message is interpreted. So, for example, listening to a recording of a speaker doesn't have the same psychological impact as listening to someone who is saying the same things in person or watching that person on television. And there's a famous example that is provided on the history.com website. And it was an example of John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon's presidential debate in 1960. And so on camera, Nixon looked away from the camera at the reporters asking him questions. And he was sweating, he was pale, he had facial hair stubble, and he wore a gray suit that faded into the set background. And the mayor of Chicago said of Nixon, oh my goodness, they've embalmed him before he even died. Kennedy, on the other hand, looked into the camera. He was tanned. He wore a dark suit that made him stand out from the background. And he appeared to be calm after spending a weekend with aides practicing in a hotel room. So he looked calm. Now, here's what's really interesting. For people who listened to the radio broadcast of the debate, they felt that it was a tie or that Nixon had won. But for those who were watching the televised debate, 70% of the viewers thought that Kennedy was the winner. The next aspect of the communication model is noise. And noise refers to anything that interferes with the message transmission or how it's received. And there are several different types of noise. We might have physiological noise, and this might be different things going on in a person's body or different states that interfere with the message. So let's say that a speaker has a headache or maybe is sick, or if audience members are hot or if they're hungry. This, of course, may interfere with message accuracy. Another type of noise could be psychological, and this might be a mental state or emotional state that affects the message transmission or reception. So if a person's just broken up with a significant other, or if they're worried about a family member in the hospital, or if they're just thinking about a shopping list, this could interfere with the communication process. There also can be noise that's physical, and this would be just the actual sound level in a room. So, if there are there's loud music that's playing in a background, that's of course going to affect how well you're able to receive that message or to convey the message. And another type of noise is cultural noise. And this is a type of interference that comes from differences in people's worldviews. And as most of you know, a worldview is the overall framework that an individual, through which a person sees and how they think about the world and how they interpret the world and interact with it. So an example of this could be, how do some people, maybe the people we're communicating with, how do they tend to acquire knowledge, and what counts as knowledge? Who are they going to trust, and who do they deem as a credible source? Or another might be just our belief system, how we see reality and what we see as being true or not true. Do we think that aliens are from outer space and that they exist, or that humans will be extinct in 200 years? What is our, and what are our religious views? How does that then impact how we send the message and receive the message? And then also our value system. That can be another source of noise that's related to this cultural noise. What do we think is good or right, wrong or bad or fair or unfair? And then, how do we see ourselves in terms of, in relation to others? Do we feel like we're responsible for other people, and that we want to make sure other people are cared for in the world, or are we primarily concerned with ourselves? And so those are just some examples of noise that would be related to culture. And I think it's important when we're communicating, it's really important that we take those into consideration. Finally, we have the context, and this is the environment within which the communication takes place. And I think if you went back years ago, prior to having using the internet as a significant way of communicating, and prior to the frequent use of cell phones for communicating, I think you would see that most people would have thought that the actual context was a physical setting. But people communicate in many other ways besides these physical settings that have historically been thought of. And I think we also need to keep in mind too that not only are we talking about the actual places or the environment where communication is taking place, we have to ask ourselves, what are the rules? Or the unwritten rules, I guess you could say, that govern these settings? What are the unwritten rules that govern texting, for example? What are the unwritten rules that govern communicating with a friend online? So, or what are the unwritten rules in communicating with your parents versus friends? I have this image here for you to think about the effects of parental use of computers and cell phones on children. And in particular, I've seen a lot of recent research on the effects of parental cell phone use on children. And so, we know that parents can be very easily distracted by phones and other mobile devices. And I think this is, based on the research, this actually is fairly concerning. And this is because there are links between parental use of mobile devices and child outcomes. And some of these include things like lower awareness and sensitivity to the child, fewer verbal and nonverbal interactions, less coordinated parenting and co-parenting, dissatisfaction with time spent together, and negative child reactions like problem behaviors. Of course, this is a complex issue because that many of the reasons that parents use devices can be due to some work pressures, but some of the reasons are not due to work pressures. Sometimes they are due to things that are perhaps more under the control of the parent. Maybe like getting device notifications frequently and wanting to check their phone. It could also be due to some social pressures. And so I think it's important for parents to be aware of this, and there's certainly a lot of room for further research in this area, but definitely something for parents to think about. I have children. I definitely think about this. I want to, in front of my kids, make sure that if I have my phone and I'm looking at it, I like to tell them why I am. I like to tell them
hey, I'm just checking something for such and such a reason, and then I put it down and put it away from me. So if I'm checking something, and I mean, I'm only going to check something generally in front of my kids if it's something that I know is, really important. Like I might say, hey, I really need to check something going on at my work, or I wanted to look a recipe up because I'm thinking about what we're going to have for dinner, so that I actually see, my children feel like I'm engaged with them. I'm certainly not perfect at this by any means, but I really do try to make that intentional effort with my kids, because I think about how that feels to my children if I'm looking at my phone and not paying attention to what they're sharing with me. So one channel of communication, of course, is one that's electronically mediated, and this is communication that takes place by way of technology. I think here it's important to note that when we think about the use of cell phones, many of us are so used to using our phones and having our phones with us that we feel like something very significant is missing if we don't have our phones in our hands or near us. And so there's definitely some things that we want to think about in terms of etiquette. And I think we need to, if we think about the last chapter in automatic processing versus more mindful or controlled processing, that if we're, for example, your book describes this, if we're out to dinner with friends or we're eating a meal with our family, and maybe there's a lull in conversation, and we don't really we might feel a little bit bored for a moment, let's say. The habit, because we're used to having our phone with us, is to look at our phone. But of course, the person who has cooked the nice meal or the people who are present with us can construe this as rude, and we probably don't want to come across that way, but it certainly can come across that way. I think that we have to really work on that habit. And that's another interesting area of research, I think, is what are the effects of cell phone use on social relationships. There's a lot of interesting avenues to go down in that area. As I'm pointing this out and I'm bringing up ideas for different areas of research, I do want to point out that for wherever you transfer to, it's very likely that you could do an honors thesis during your senior year. And this means you could do an original research study where you design an experiment, for example, and conduct it. Or you might do survey research, or you might do some other type of research some other type of research method that you learned about this semester or in other classes. And so as you're reading your textbook, I think if you're thinking about doing an honors thesis or later doing research, think about the areas that are most interesting to you. And in addition, think about the areas where there's not been a lot of research done. Certainly, there's probably quite a bit of research done on cell phone use, but not nearly as much in this area as there would have been on, let's say, the effects of television viewing on children, because televisions have been around a lot longer. So in areas that are newly emerging, you'll find that there's a lot more opportunities for you to do research in those areas. I think you each know the different dimensions and how they vary in face-to-face versus internet communication. What I would really encourage you to think about is how can we improve communication using technology so that we're actually getting the richness that we want to. I think we're seeing this with, in the age of now COVID, where people are exploring new options and new ways of communicating that maybe they hadn't before, perhaps in older generations who were maybe less used to using, let's say, FaceTime, or less used to using WhatsApp or other apps that allowed for richer communication. They may be more inclined to use them now. But think about, even in your own lives, how can you enhance that richness of communication? And I think that's something that even still, even though we've had technology like like cell phones around for a very long time, still there's a lot missing in that, so that people don't feel like they're getting from communication through technology what they would ordinarily get face to face. Social networking sites are one means by which many people communicate. And of course, in the age of COVID and the pandemic that we're in, the use of social networking can be very helpful in promoting communication between people who might otherwise not be able to communicate except through text or over the phone or email. So social networking certainly has its benefits. However, I wonder how many of you spend hours browsing through social media. Spending too long on social networking sites, as many of you may know, can adversely affect your mood. In fact, chronic users are more likely to report poor mental health, including symptoms of anxiety and depression. I don't think it's hard to figure out why. As many of you know, social media lets you see the carefully selected best parts of everyone else's lives, and then you compare your life to other people's lives. In particular, you might be likely to compare the negative aspects of your life to all of the positive things that someone else is sharing. And so comparing yourself to other people is a sure path to anxiety. And especially if we are regularly seeing very positive experiences that other people have, and we're contrasting them with some of our own negative life experiences. And social media has made this easy to do. Whereas in the past, we would have maybe just heard about a friend's experience. Maybe we would go to school and we'd hear something about it and that was it. But now we're repeatedly reminded of all the good things that other people are experiencing, and we then may contrast that with our own experiences. Another issue with social networking is that it increases the likelihood of experiencing bullying, in particular cyberbullying. So while social media can make it easier to meet new people, make friends, communicate with friends, and share with others, it can also enable cruel people to tear into other people with little effort. And when we think about this issue of social media and bullying, perpetrators of bullying can use anonymity that social networks provide to gain people's trust and then may, in some instances, terrorize them in front of their peers. Sometimes social media might lead to, or the use of social media, especially excessively, might lead to a fear of missing out. So, you are, you're afraid you're going to miss out on positive experiences that someone else is having. So let's say you constantly check your messages to see if anyone has invited you out, or you focus on your Instagram feed all day to make sure that nobody is doing something, cool without you. We know also that social media can lead to unrealistic expectations. So most social media sites really lack an online authenticity. So think about, Snapchat, where people share their adventures or things that they're doing with their friends, and they post how much they love their significant other on Facebook or Instagram, and then they load these, what they're feeling onto, with images that are very heavily staged. So, you really don't know as an individual, is this staged or is it a farce? And while it looks great on the surface, the person could be, on bad terms with their significant other, or they might be really desperate to get Instagram likes as a form of validation, but you don't know this. And especially if we're under stress, if we're already feeling anxious, we're not likely to engage in that mindful thinking at first. We might go to that automatic processing, which is not very rational. As many of you know too, the frequent use of social media can have a negative effect on body image. And as many of you know today, body image is an issue for lots of people, for especially, in high school and college, but really for almost any age group. And so on a daily basis, people, as they're visiting social media, they may feel very conscious about how they look different from those of their, the pictures that they're posting. And of course, how they look different from the pictures that they see of other individuals. So that disparity between the images that they see of themselves, which maybe those images are more favorable because they've used some editor, and then how they see themselves in the mirror, or perhaps they don't like how they look and they don't want to post those images online as they contrast those images with already photoshopped images of others. I think it's important to note too that the use of social media can lead to very unhealthy sleep patterns. We know that regular experience of light, especially at night, can affect the secretion of melatonin. Your book also describes privacy and security issues. I think it's important to note this as well. Keep in mind, as all of you probably know, that what you post online never goes away. Even if you delete it, there is always some record of that. So take a look at that section in your book as well. I think it's important too to note that your book suggests that people often fail to use privacy protections because they have this optimistic bias, or they assume that their own online privacy is fine, but others are at risk. The truth is that all of us are at risk. Interpersonal communication is important for a variety of reasons. Some major reasons include the following. Effective communication is essential for many important aspects of life. Think about your communication with your parents, your other family members, your friends, your significant other, the people you work with, the people you work for. All of these relationships are based on effective communication, especially if we want them to be successful. Good communication also enhances satisfaction in relationships, and poor communication is a major cause of breakup. So knowing how to be a good communicator is very important in a variety of areas of our own lives, and that's why it is a chapter in your textbook on adjustment.
What have you learned? Well, you've learned about the process of interpersonal communication, and you've also learned about the different components and features of the communication process. You learned about technology and its role in interpersonal communication and social networking and communication. And you also learned about the relationship between communication and adjustment. What will you be learning about next? Next, you'll be learning about the general principles of nonverbal communication. You'll also be learning about the elements of nonverbal communication. I think this is a very interesting topic, and I think you'll find it to be very interesting as well. You'll be learning about things like body language and eye contact. You'll learn about personal space, and these are just a few of the interesting topics that you'll be learning about that are related to nonverbal communication. You'll also be learning about detecting deception and what the research has to say we can look for if we want to detect dishonesty. And then you're going to be learning about the significance of nonverbal communication. As always, please do not hesitate to reach out to me with any questions that you have. I look forward to seeing each of you online.